It's really nice to see everyone. My name is Joanne Biao. I'm associate professor at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. So before we start, thank you again for joining us. So Tiffany Chuang, who's our speaker today, is a sociologist whose research interests include urban development, political culture, and the politics of collective memory. She's currently a lecturer at NUS College, National University of Singapore, and she received her PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan College of Literature, Science, and the Arts in 2023. Today, I'm actually really excited about this particular presentation that we have. Tiffany is taking on a really wonderful, popular mode of Singaporean culture, which is ghost stories, and thinking about that and urban memory and collective memory and development in Singapore. And this is really, I've read the paper, it's fantastic. I'm looking forward to hearing her share her work. Um, I think I would like to introduce our discussant as well, who'll be coming in after Tiffany, who's reviewed her paper and will be able to share his thoughts. And so we're so delighted and thankful to welcome Wei Sing Gui, who is professor of English at the University of California, Riverside. He works on global Anglophone literatures with a focus in Southeast Asia and its diasporas. And he's the author of National Consciousness and Literary Cosmopolitics. He has edited 2 journal special issues and has published several journal articles and book chapters. My esteemed colleague and friend, and thank you so much for doing this as well. Service to the profession. And so without further ado, I'll let Tiffany take over. I'm looking forward to hearing your work, Tiffany.
Thank you so much, Joanne. Well, first of all, thank you everybody for joining us on this lovely Sunday morning. I'd like to first start by thanking the Academia SG team as well as my discussant, Wei Sin Gui. Without any further ado, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, so my talk today is entitled Reclaiming Moral Agency Through Ghost Stories in Singapore. And I'd just like to start with a little disclaimer. In the interest of time and knowing the audience, this talk is going to assume that most of the audience is familiar with a local Singaporean context, particularly the basic contours of Singapore's dominant developmental narrative, the move from mostly kampongs and villages to public housing in Singapore, as well as some of our more famous cast of ghosts and folklore, like the Pontianak and whatnot. But that's it. Please feel free to ask for clarification in the chat or in the Q&A after my talk if you would like more information about this. Secondly, this is a work in progress, so I hope everybody understands that I won't be sharing my slides, but I'll be happy to follow up in a discussion with anybody who is interested in this topic. All right. So as you may have read from the blurb, the publicity materials for my talk, the source for today's discussion is Russell Lee's Singapore True Ghost Stories. And so because this is a talk about stories, let's start with a story. I'm going to tell you a story. So this is a basic outline of, could I just ask could I just remind everyone to turn off their mics to mute themselves because I'm picking up some background noise. For anyone who's familiar with this series and the format it takes, it's a collection, each series is a collection of short stories, putatively authored by a regular Singaporean from that Singaporean's point of view. And sometimes Russell Lee, the putative author, gives a little commentary at the end of it. So this is from a story entitled literally Grandmother's Story by one Bibik Nur, 67 years old. So once upon a time in Singapore, at some unspecified year, there was an old kampong in Whampoa. So a kampong is, it refers to either a rural village or in Singapore, it could, in the Singaporean context, it could also have referred to informal housing, on the city fringe or even in the city. And Whampoa was one of the, it was an old neighborhood in Singapore. So there was an old kampong once upon a time. And in this kampong, there lived a woman named Giku, who's Chinese, on the elderly side, and she was a money-minded individual. She was, she was old, but she was greedy, and she was always trying to make money in unscrupulous ways. And one day, she was pondering something that she heard. She heard that it was possible to get rich by enslaving a spirit called the Pontianak, and basically forced the spirit to use her supernatural knowledge to give Giku, our protagonist, our antagonist, actually, insider information on how to, I don't know, win the lottery. That's what she wanted to do. So just to review our local folklore, the Pontianak is a female spirit who died in childbirth. I mean, she was human. She died in childbirth, and now she's vengeful, and she goes around attacking, seeking vengeance, basically, on pregnant women. Sometimes she attacks men. So that's the Pontianak. But some of the defining characteristics of the Pontianak are that she is a nature spirit. She resides in forests, that's her home. And legend has it that she especially likes to roost in banana trees. So what our antagonist Giku had heard, and this is kind of a common, it's not common knowledge per se, but what Giku had heard was that you can enslave and trap a Pontianak, bring it under your thumb to do your bidding by wrapping a red string around the banana tree to bind her. And also, what Giku did this time around was to stick a row of silver pins into the banana tree to bind the Pontianak, make her do Giku's bidding, make Giku rich. Well, and it worked. It worked. Whoops, that's the pretend you didn't see that. So it worked, and Giku did indeed get rich. She won the lottery, and with that money, she set up established an illegal money lending business. She had a coterie of gangsters who basically pressured people to pay up. So it was a very predatory operation. And of course, these things, they bite you. They come back and bite you eventually. So one of Giku's debtors eventually killed himself, and this angered the debtor's wife. And so this wife realized that something was going on and wanted revenge on Giku. And she tracked Giku for a while and realized that all of this had something to do with that banana tree, because Giku would keep going back there, and she saw the row of pins, and she used some powers of deduction, and one day she snuck out the back and freed the Pontianak. She didn't know what she was doing, but she just removed the row of pins. The Pontianak got loose, and I think we all know what happens here. It didn't end well for Giku. The Pontianak had a whole row of grievances. It killed Giku. The next day, I mean, they didn't describe her death, but the next day, Giku was found murdered in a pool of blood. It was all very grisly, and she died. So this should have been the end of the story, and it's a nice, neat ending. It's kind of a grisly story, but we all saw this coming. And thumbs up if you saw this coming. Giku messed around and she found out. And so that's kind of the end of that narrative. But what I found interesting when reading and analyzing Russell Lee's True Ghost Stories, and actually I read this story as a long time ago when it came out. What really lodged in my mind was that the story didn't end here. So the last sentence of this story, which should have wrapped up as a nice fable, was this. The author, Bibik Noor, ended by saying, "I know some people who are alive today who can still remember this incident at that Whampoa kampong. That kampong has had to make way for HDB flats now." I couldn't articulate it at the time that I read this as a child, actually, giving away my age here. but this is kind of introducing a loose end to the story, and it's not really clear where this is going. But this was the concluding line to the story in Volume 4, 1994, and it doesn't even end there. So the editor of True Singapore Ghost Stories, Russell Lee, adds a little postscript to this story. And yeah, he's being tongue-in-cheek and everything, but of all the themes in the story that he could have picked up to comment on, he picks up that last sentence. I wonder where the Pontianaks live now in modern Singapore, where banana trees are hard to find. They go across the causeway, I suppose, so this refers to the Pontianaks crossing one of our causeways to go to neighboring Malaysia. So that was the story, and that was the postscript. And I thought, great story, which raises a couple of questions, more questions than it answers, actually. And the question I had was, and the question I posed to everybody is there a moral to this story? Well, clearly there is, but what is this moral exactly? And if there is a moral, is it just about the Pontianak? Is it just about Giku, or is there something else going on? Is there a broader critique embedded in this story and many others in True Singapore Ghost Stories, of which this is just one? So the main argument that I'll put forth to everyone today for your consideration is, well, yes to all the questions. Yes, there's a moral. No, it doesn't just revolve around the Pontianak. There's something deeper going on in this story and many others like it. And in my study, I examined ghost stories as a ground-up moral narrative and critique, not just of the situation, but broader social changes and developmental forces and broader political developments and structures. And more than that, I examined ghost stories as a platform and a vehicle for constituting moral agency. So this brings me to the next section of my talk. So to understand the significance of the concept of moral agency, let's have a look at the main body of literature scholarly literature that I am engaging in dialogue with. So really, I'm engaging in dialogue with the new sociology of morality. Sociology has been fascinated with questions of morality under different names, different guises, ever since its inception, really, since the founders of the discipline first churned out their works. But this relatively new, in the last 2 decades, this relatively new subdiscipline of the new sociology of morality is not so much about understanding what constitutes right or wrong to begin with, right or wrong per se. And it's really more about examining morality as a social construct. And so the sociology of morality, sociologists who study morality are not so much concerned with, is this right or is this wrong? Is this behavior desirable or is it not? But how does society come to understand certain phenomena as desirable, normatively correct or right? And when does society determine something to be wrong? How are these notions collectively constructed, and how do these notions change over time? And as with all discourses and norms and values that are collectively constructed, notions of morality are very much determined, very much influenced by existing power structures where, no surprise, there are dominant notions of morality that are established by powerful actors like the state. And of course, there's the force and the power of public opinion. But like all social factors, although there are power relations involved, and yes, it is difficult to escape the strictures of dominant morality, people resist, people negotiate. So it's a very dynamic field of contestation. And what constitutes morality, norms, and values, they do change. They evolve according to the social and historical context. So another key feature in the sociological study of morality is this notion of thick morality. So thin morality is just a surface level study of what's right and what's wrong at a very normative level. But thick morality looks at the entire iceberg of social determinants, cultural determinants, and psychological factors. So not only does it consider notions of right and wrong, it looks at how morality is enacted in everyday life and how it persists. There are moral codes, norms, and rules that govern what we do on an everyday basis, because most of the time we are not explicitly cogitating on whether things are right or wrong. We seem to operate based on reflex, but actually it's not. It's just deeply ingrained and embodied norms, rules, and expectations and roles that we play. And then there's the role of emotion, which guides us. It serves as a sort of fast thinking kind of guide that helps us determine on an everyday basis at a subconscious level what constitutes right and wrong. And just to go back to the second point here, in this scheme of thinking, what constitutes moral? The opposite of moral is not immoral in the sense of bad, but rather non-moral. So it's a morally irrelevant phenomenon. That would be the opposite of moral. So the new sociology of morality has been applied to many different contexts. And one of these contexts most relevant to our study today is the study of how people make sense of urban change and urban development and redevelopment, which so often comes from above. Usually it's in so many contexts, and we are more than familiar with this in the Singaporean context, it's the state, and in other countries, in other contexts, private actors, corporations also play a very prominent role, but it's basically powerful actors enacting top-down urban change, demolition, which uproots communities, it uproots lives, and it's traumatic and dislocating to people. And so there is a wealth of literature on how ordinary people resist these changes, or at least resist forgetting the old orders that were swept away. They assert their claims to urban space by telling stories. Sometimes there's outright resistance and collective action, but even without that, there are plenty of efforts to just everyday actions, telling stories to remember the communities that were swept away. And in this process, inevitably, it's a moral process, a very moralizing process, where the people who are the victims of summary redevelopment they brand themselves, or they represent themselves as morally wrong, and the people, the actors, the institutions who instituted this change as morally deficient or breaching the some kind of moral contract in one way or another. So the sociology of morality, the study of how morality has been socially constructed and how it evolves with the social context, is a thriving field. But in much of the literature that I surveyed, there's been a focus, rightly so, but there's been a lot of, most of the focus is on the substance of this moral content. So exactly what counts as moral, how is it defined, what are the moral scripts that evolve, and who plays a role in constituting them. So the strength, but also I argue one of the drawbacks of this approach is that what counts as moral, these moral scripts, these moral narratives, it keeps changing with the times, and we kind of assume the underlying assumption, the working assumption is that it just changes according to self-interest, and that's not wrong, but I wanted to look at something a little bit deeper that drives these changes. Is there some kind of, is there an underlying engine that's a bit more stable and not so reactive? Is there an underlying logic that the people, the ordinary people who tell these stories appeal to when constituting moral narratives or engaging in these moral projects. And so that's where I came up with this is where I proposed the concept of moral agency. So moral agency, in my understanding, is the capacity. Agency is a capacity to act. So moral agency is the capacity to determine moral standards, norms, and expectations, the cushy layer of thick morality, basically. So it's the attempt to appropriate this capacity to define what counts as moral in the first place in a way that centers the agent's needs and misunderstandings, excuse me. So the content of this moral script, the iceberg of thick morality can change depending on the circumstances and the institutions. But the thing that remains constant, that inner drive, moral agency is a constant. And I hope to show through the analysis of True Singapore Ghost Stories that, well, the ghost stories in this series are they represent an attempt to reclaim Singaporeans' moral agency in the face of the state's developmental efforts and also dominant moral projects by the state. So first of all, why ghost stories? Why study ghost stories as a vehicle for the constitution of moral agency? Well, one of the strengths and weaknesses of ghost stories as a source is that ghost stories are not considered respectable at all. They are very marginalized narratives. They are not considered legitimate political discussion topics. It's not something that you bring up in serious everyday conversation. And this is a really interesting feature of ghost stories because on the one hand, they are not official, they're not legitimate, but on the other hand, they provide a unique and a valuable window into the voices of the marginalized because ghost stories are where people have a lot of leeway to voice their grievances with some element of plausible deniability. So there's really no accountability or need to check your sources when you tell a ghost story. It's kind of like rumors, but even more of a wild card. So there's a lot of critique that goes into the study of. There's a lot of critique that goes into ghost stories. And many of these critiques are political. And if you look at the themes that are that emerge from the study of multiple ghost stories, often they are critiques about development, political development, and social change. And so ghost stories, as many scholars who study ghost stories have known, they often contain a window into collective anxieties about gender, race, class, and of course, urban change, which is a huge subject of True Singapore Ghost Stories and a really important part of Singaporeans' recent collective memory. Another valuable feature of ghost stories, especially this series, is that ghost stories around the world, spectral tales of hauntings are very spatial. They are inherently spatial because think of the last time you heard a ghost story or watched a horror movie that was not embedded in some kind of place. If you watch horror or you read a ghost story, the setting is as important, almost as important as the ghost or the supernatural force involved. It is a character unto itself, and ghost stories are almost always all about the place. It wouldn't be the same. I mean, it just wouldn't make sense to have a haunting, to be haunted by the Pontianak in, Times Square in New York. Ghosts and hauntings are very local for the most part. And finally, ghost stories are the perfect lens for what we want to study because ghost stories, more often than not, are morality tales. They are explicitly moral. Retribution and vengeance are such important themes in ghost stories, there's usually some kind of wrong, some kind of vengeance or grievance. And when you look beneath the surface of wrongs and grievances, this is a huge red flag or a huge clue that some kind of moral norm or expectation has been violated, hence necessitating the retribution. So now let's narrow this down even further. What can we gain from looking at this particular series of True Singapore ghost stories? So Russell, this is a series that I think is familiar to many Singaporeans. It is practically a social institution by now, and maybe you could give me a thumbs up. I can actually see thumbs up if you grew up reading this or if you read a copy recently. So a little bit about this study, and I have the whole collection on my shelf right here. This is volume 1, and I have the whole collection behind me. This is a 27 volume series, and each volume has about 50 to 70 stories. It's about just slightly over about 150 pages. The first volume was published in 1991. It made its debut at a book fair and it immediately sold out. A couple of thousand copies. It was gone in a very, very short while. It sold like hotcakes. And this remains one of the best-selling Singaporean titles to this day. It predictably and reliably sells out. And so far, 1.5 million copies from this entire series have been sold. There's no breakdown from the publishers about the demographics, who's buying them, how many of these purchases were made in Singapore and how many were made around the region. So this has a predominantly Singaporean audience, and most of the stories are set in Singapore, and those are the stories that I focus on. But just for interest's sake, this series is also very popular in Malaysia and Indonesia and around the region. But I'm guessing a good number of that 1.5 million copies were sold in Singapore. The authorship of this this series is really interesting. I think it's almost so. Apologies if this is if this is akin to debunking Santa Claus, but by now we're pretty sure, we're 99.999% sure that there's no Russell Lee. It's a pseudonym, and this series is really put together by a team of ghostwriters. There are some familiar names. Damien Sin has been a huge contributor to this series, but Russell Lee is the official, the name of the official editor of this series. So most of these stories were collected by a team of ghostwriters, and it's sourced from it's like doing journalism and interviews. Most of these stories were sourced from the writer's personal contacts, and this series does solicit reader contributions, and we know that they get legitimate, real reader contributions because they offer cash prizes if your letter gets published, sometimes even if it doesn't. So they offer cash prizes, vouchers, and other prizes, and they publish the names of the people who send their stories in. I do not think, so this isn't very clear, but from studying the content pages, I don't think that reader contributions like letters and stuff form the bulk of the stories that get published, because most of the audience is very young. I'm talking about primary school children. This is another feature of the series. It has a very young audience. Children make up a huge, one of the biggest demographics of, this Russell Lee series. And I think Singaporeans below the age of 30, 35 can attest to this, that we had a lot of book fairs in primary school, and Russell Lee's stories are kind of a staple there. Now, on the one hand, The fact that, so again, we don't have any real figures on the readership, the exact readership breakdown. But what is the significance of the very young audience? Well, on the one hand, you could say that this is evidence that this is not a very serious series because it's basically a children's, it's read by children. So perhaps you could make a case that it doesn't have much of a reach in terms of an influential audience. But on the other hand, the fact that it has a young audience means that it has been imprinting generations of Singaporeans, and it's practically like a shadow syllabus by now. And yeah, it's practically a shadow syllabus by now. And this ties in with the previous point from the previous slide about this series being very moralizing, actually. And this series actually started becoming more and more preachy and moral. I don't mean preachy in a bad way, in case anybody from the publishing company is here. But it became more explicitly moralizing very early on in the series, so you know what the stand of the series is. So as for analyzing this entire series, it raises important questions about what kind of source this is. So in the first place, social scientists and sociologists, political scientists, and colleagues across social sciences don't typically study fiction in the first place, let alone ghost stories. But this series of True Singapore Ghost Stories poses yet another problem because it's not entirely clear whether this is supposed to be fiction or nonfiction, what kind of genre this is. Because on the one hand, if you don't believe in spirits, I mean, and you have to take a lot of these stories with a pinch of salt, it's embellished, they're tongue in cheeks. They're tongue in cheek, excuse me, but on the one hand, it is fictitious. It is heavily embellished. You can see the imprint of the human mind and human embellishment. But on the other hand, it poses itself as nonfiction, albeit with a degree of plausible deniability. I mean, it has to be taken seriously as accounts that really happened to some Singaporean somewhere, even if the names and locations have been changed. So I analyzed it as a narrative, and I kind of bracket the question of whether it is real or not. And if it is fictitious, it is fiction that has to be taken seriously and to connect with and to be connected with and to resonate with very real elements of real people's lives. And it is implicitly and explicitly moralistic, and it's also a valuable historical source and a valuable historical window into Singapore's development, because these volumes are published almost annually, and they are meant to be, on the one hand, historical, to tap on collective memory, but also to be very current. So they reference current affairs, current pop culture, and reading through this entire series from 1991 to the present is kind of like looking into a time capsule. Okay, so what did I analyze from reading this entire series? So having read this entire series, all 27 volumes, a couple of times over, first of all, there is a huge range of places and spaces that this is set within, and there were many themes that I was not able to delve into, at least not for this project. But there were some spaces that kept recurring so often that it would have been remiss not to investigate the patterns involved. So because this is a palimpsest of Singaporean history and it taps on important aspects of Singaporean life, there are naturally plenty of stories about the kampong and the HD and public housing. So there were, I counted, 29 stories about the kampong, which doesn't sound like a lot, but the themes recur in a way that is very significant. And I chose these spaces, the kampong and the HDB, because these are the spaces that are the most relevant to Singapore's developmental trajectory and developmental narrative. So most of the kampong stories are, obviously they are remembered. They are told as stories from days of yore. And unsurprisingly, there are many more, almost 3 times the number of stories that are set in public housing. So there are 83. And by the way, this is an undercount. This is very likely an undercount of the stories that are set in public housing, because I only noted down, collected, and took notes on the stories where it was explicitly clear that it was set in a public housing estate or apartment. There are many others that just say, oh, it was set in a flat. So those could have been condominiums, but I'm guessing statistically they're likely to be public housing as well. But I didn't even include those, and there are 83 set in public housing. So that is the source of my data. So having read through the entire these stories in their broader historical context, what are some of my findings in terms of moral agency? So I found some themes in terms of the kinds of moral agency. So in both of these stories, you can see moral agency being exercised by the editors, the storytellers, and also by the audience who likes to read these stories. There's a different type of moral agency that is being claimed and exercised for kampong stories on the one hand, and HDB stories on the other hand. And the moral agency that comes from below in these stories has to be read as a foil to official discourse and moral projects. So what was the state trying to promulgate? What was the state trying to tell people was the right way to understand Singapore's development and the right way to live? So on the one hand, how has the kampong as a whole been represented, been portrayed by the state? And this continues till today. I think this will resonate with many readers who many of you who have spent some time in Singapore. Kampongs have long been caricatured as backwards impediments to modernity. They're dirty, they don't have proper running water and all that, or they tend to be romanticized and idealized as this idyllic beacon of community spirit where everybody was simple, everyone was nice, and there was gotong royong, which is still a term that you can still see on posters on government grassroots events whenever they try to evoke a simple community vibe. But the kampong that you read about in True Singapore Ghost Stories is a little bit different, okay? It's not a simple place. It is a sordid place where terrible, sordid things happen, violent things that if they were in a movie, it would be rated R. But that's it. Even though the kampong in True Singapore Ghost Stories is sordid, violent, and not always a very nice place, it is a very morally self-contained universe where disputes are resolved internally. And ultimately, that lingering last note, that postscript, is really a critique that the entire kampong universe was demolished in the first place. On the other hand, we see a different kind of moral agency, but moral agency nonetheless being exercised in the HDB stories. So what's the dominant narrative about HDBs that I think will ring true with many of you? Well, public housing, when the state embarked on its massive public housing project, it represented HDBs as the beacon of modernity and progress. It was full of, it had running water, concrete walls, it was scientifically rational, and it was also a clean slate. So many HDB estates were either built over reclaimed forests, cemeteries, but also reclaimed and demolished villages. So HDBs were a clean slate. Whatever came before that had to make way, and it was just this new world order. And this will come in handy later. And in contrast to the morally self-contained or at least how the kampong was imagined to be morally self-contained. In contrast to that, public housing was an extension, gave the state a golden opportunity. It was an important platform for the state to extend its institutions of governance. It became, in the words of anthropologist James Scott, much more legible to the state. It was easy, when you have modern rational public housing, it becomes very easy for the state to expand its police agencies, law and order, for instance, and social services, and a whole panoply of other state agencies in a way that was a lot more difficult to do in the messy and disordered and rambunctious kampong. But on the other, so another imperative that was that HDB living imposed on people, it was just the modern urban condition of living with strangers. So unlike the kampong where the village where you knew everybody and everybody was familiar, now living in public housing meant that you had to live with strangers, many of whom you would never meet. And we, many of us are familiar with government policies, official policies to regulate this condition of living with people and forcibly integrate people using things like the ethnic integration policy. So what is the shadow morality, the counterpart to this to these imperatives of modern HDB living? Well, and I'm going to elaborate on this in greater detail, but the stories in this series tell quite a different story about public housing living. First of all, they're old friends, so it's not a clean slate. So HDB residents do get visited by old friends. The stories acknowledge the expanded role of the state. I mean, it is hard to ignore the role of the police, but in these stories, the state and state agents, police officers, and social workers are subordinated to the the imperatives and to the interests and the agency of ordinary Singaporeans. So there's a lot of acknowledgement of inescapable facets of urban living, but these stories appropriate these imperatives to serve people's own terms. So, for example, neighborliness, that is also enacted by residents' own terms. And finally, these stories in the series re-enchant the urban landscape to make it less sterile. So I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but not too much, because you'll have to read the stories for yourself. I don't want to give any spoilers, but also we don't have that much time. So the morally sordid kampong, against the official narrative of the kampong as backwards but idyllic. The kampong in these stories is sordid. It's violent. There are people getting murdered. Well, we could talk about. I mean, gender is a whole different piece, but it involves a lot of women getting murdered. Sometimes there's sexual violence. Women, young girls going to the city, coming back in disgrace. There's suicide, infanticide, people getting thrown down the well. There are a few stories with themes of money lending, so punishing greed, against which violates the spirit of sharing and collective morality, mechanical solidarity in the urban kampong. But the upshot is that this kampong is occasionally sordid and occasionally violent, which is very much not the gotong royong image that the state would have us, that you see on posters nowadays. It is a complicated, sordid place. Nonetheless, notwithstanding the violence, infanticide, femicide, and the gore of the kampong in this series is nonetheless morally self-contained. So when there are moral disruptions involved, so somebody, engages in predatory money lending, somebody gets killed, these disruptions are resolved within Kampong. Oh, sorry, I'm hearing some feedback from somebody's mic. If you could if you could mute yourself, that would be great. Okay, back to this. Moral disruptions are always resolved within the Kampong. So either the villagers restore order. If it was a ghost that was the problem, it's a villager that puts an end to it by vanquishing the ghost or whatever. Or in the story that I opened with at the beginning of this talk, sometimes the ghosts themselves are agents of justice or they avenge themselves. But you know who's not there? One actor who is conspicuously absent from the moral universe of the Kampong is the state. The police rarely get involved, with the exception of 2 stories. But in all those 29 stories, I only counted twice. 2 occasions on which the police made an appearance, but the police don't get involved in restoring order. And you would think the police would get involved if someone died a very grisly death, or people are engaging in blood feuds, but they don't. So the state is not there. And how is this an exercise of moral agency? How are these narratives an exercise of moral agency? Well, the underlying message here is that the Kampong may have been a messy place sometimes, but we didn't need the state to solve our problems. We could solve our problems on our own. And this idea of being able to solve our problems on our own sets the context for the bigger critique here, that lingering note of lament that I shared with you at the beginning of the talk. There's this note of lament after all said and done, all these terrible things that happened in the Kampong and that got put right. At the end of the day, the true lament, or at least the lament on which the story ends, is that the villages were demolished. There was this whole ecosystem where people had their problems, but they solved it. And the grievance is not that these terrible things happened in the village, but that the state, through its summary clearance and demolition of these villages, took away the opportunity for villagers to solve these problems on their own. And so that, I believe, is what's driving some of this lament. And this didn't happen just once in this series of stories. There were a few other stories like this in the series. And actually, as the series wore on, it became less subtle. This message became less subtle. And for example, in volume 10, read the story yourself. They should pay me a commission. They actually sent me gifts because I ordered all of them at the same time. All right, so that is the note of lament. So when we move to HDB stories, I think you know this. Story quite well. We were all moved there, tabula rasa, except it wasn't a tabula rasa. This series had its fair share of Pontianak stories and also random hauntings. Except I shouldn't use the word random because many of these hauntings were attributed to old ghosts and the fact that the HDBs were built on old cemeteries and cleared forests. And this represents a continuation of the critique of Kampong demolition, resisting the tabula rasa narrative. So we start to see a greater appearance, a more frequent appearance of the state, especially when it comes to justice, the restoration of justice. You can't have people conducting blood feuds without the police getting involved. But in many of these stories, the ghosts themselves are agents of vigilante justice, which, if you think about it, does double duty. On the one hand, it acknowledges the importance and the dominance of the state, but it's also kind of a critique of the state, because if the police were so effective, why do we need to get ghosts involved in the first place? So the moral agency here is that the state serves the people, but it's also a critique of the state's limits, and the state serves the the police are the sidekick to the ghosts, actually, in this story. Another interesting feature I regret I didn't get to talk about is that a really curious corollary to urban living and forest integration is that many of the ghosts in HDB stories are strangers. Okay, unlike in the kampong where you know the provenance of this ghost is either a Pontiana or somebody who died. Many of the ghosts in this story series are strangers, but the people in this series, they don't have a hardline attitude towards the ghosts. They have a complex attitude where they negotiate with these ghosts. They try to understand what's going on. Sometimes they usher them along their way. And then it's kind of like neighborliness in action. But one thing that struck me was that HDB residents who get haunted in these stories almost have more agency in choosing their neighbors, whether to let them stay or go, choosing their ghostly neighbors than actual living HDB residents, because it is really difficult to evict a resident who lives next to you. So these people actually have more choice. So re-enchanting the urban landscape, populating it with a rich spiritual life, Hungry Ghost Festival. I'm going to leave that there. I hope I hope we know about this. So it makes the landscape more not so sterile. Okay, so to summarize, the moral codes have shifted what constitutes a moral phenomenon, and the expectations have indeed evolved in the representations of these spaces. But what has remained constant is that these stories are an example of the editors and the audience wanting to see some kind of moral agency of Singaporeans in action. Do ghost stories matter? I mean, on the one hand, no, because they're not taken seriously and then they don't have any discernible impact on the policy or the economy. But on the other hand, let us not write off the impact on the real world. We can see for a whole month for the Hungry Ghost Festival, the public housing landscape is transformed in a very tangible way. But stories like these also provide a valuable window into people's life worlds, their experiences, and ultimately broaden our understandings of collective morality. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for listening, and I'm very much looking forward to what my discussant Wei-Sin has to say.
While I have not written about ghost stories, I have discussed two other genres in Singaporean and Southeast Asian fiction that share a family resemblance with ghost stories, namely the Gothic tale and noir fiction. Like ghost stories, Gothic tales and noir fiction express disillusionment, frustration, and despair at the diminishing possibilities of living a good, fulfilling life. These three types of stories, right, ghost stories, noir fiction, Gothic tales, highlight and refuse what literary critic Lauren Berlant calls the cruel optimism of normative good life genres and discourses promoted and celebrated by neoliberal states in Singapore and elsewhere in Asia as well. In the context of Tiffany Chuang's talk, Singapore's good life discourses include the romanticized space of the kampong and the ideas of the kampong spirit and gotong royong, as well as the dream, the aspiration of a respectable middle-class lifestyle, which is often marked by the safety and security of owning and possessing an HDB flat. In Dr. Chuang's analysis, Singaporean ghost stories imagine a haunted world in which supernatural beings unleash their wrath on self-serving humans or enact retribution on individuals whose transgressions somehow manage to evade the watchful eye of Singapore's criminal justice system. And ghost stories share with Gothic tales and noir fiction a sense of heightened, intensified emotions, right? These intense feelings are either experienced by the characters or aroused in readers through the dramatic and often violent atmospheres and moods crafted by the authors or the storytellers. As Dr. Chuang points out, such vivid and violent emotions are not just there for sensational values, because in her essay, she argues that ghost stories' centering of private emotions is a way of reclaiming moral agency for individuals within the context of a strong state. Like noir fiction, Singaporean ghost stories do not immediately present a clear blueprint for social change. That is painfully obvious. But in their sensational representations of injustice and inequality, they offer an absent positive of what a just and equitable society might look like, as well as other ways by which individuals can act and relate to each other outside the ambit of state governance. I now turn to two questions that came to mind as I read Dr. Chuang's essay and listened to her talk. Number one key component of Dr. Chuang's essay is reading ghost stories as acts of collective memory and remembering. While it is definitely true that the content of ghost stories draws from local myths, legends, and folk tales from bygone times, I'm struck by how the True Singapore Ghost Stories is a very contemporary series, with the most recent edition, right, being published in 2023, just last year. So these supernatural tales have a persistent presence. And by the word presence, I'm referring to the condition of having a palpable existence, but also the state of something being here and now, of being in the present. So to use the terms of Marxist cultural critic Raymond Williams, this series of ghost stories appear to be a constantly emergent or emerging fictional narrative, right, or storytelling work that draws on residual cultural elements from traditions and bygone times, and existing in a critical relationship with Singapore's dominant social and political narratives. Can we therefore think of these ghost stories not only as reminders of a bygone past, but also representing the desires, anxieties, and fears of a looming present? Is it possible that in the face of Singapore's biopolitical management of self and society, these ghost stories imagine something like a phantasma politics rather than a biopolitics, in which contests of power and agency play out not in social or public domains, but on the terrain of affect, of feelings, and emotions? And on a related note, the second question I had is regarding the allegorical register of some of the stories, right, in which ghosts or undead creatures stand for marginalized individuals in Singapore. Given Singaporeans' often heated and intense responses to immigration and migrant workers in the recent past, are there ghost stories in the series that are connected to immigration or the presence of immigrants and migrant workers? And the reason I ask is because I'm curious, right? Conventionally, the migrant or the immigrant is often represented in fiction as an alien, both literally and figuratively. They are space invaders, right? I would argue that the ghost can also be an apt allegorical figure for the migrant, right? Ghosts and other undead creatures exist in a kind of in-between state between life and death, just as migrants, especially migrant workers, often exist in an in-between state, juridically or legally, and socially and culturally in Singapore. And here I must confess, I have not read any of the more recent editions of True Singapore Ghost Stories. So I'm really curious to know if there are now more supernatural stories originating from other parts of Southeast Asia or that feature ghosts coming to Singapore's shores. And that concludes my response. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gui. So your first question was whether related to whether these stories are not just about the past, but whether they can also be read as anxieties about the future. And I think that is very much the case, absolutely 100%. And in fact, anxieties about the past are always read through the lens of the present and the future. In fact, this entire series debuted in 1991, which was a juncture in Singapore's history and development where the state was very concerned about conservation, because by the early 90s, most of Singapore, I mean, the narrative and the understanding, there was this sense that Singapore had already made it into first world status, that we had that the country was no longer a backwards fishing village, that it was already very developed. And the state was actually looking to conserve large tracts of Singapore's pre-war architecture. And this was around the time, the 90s when the Asian values discourse would start to emerge. So at that time, the early 90s, this was the milieu, this was the zeitgeist where the fear was actually that Singapore was modernizing too quickly and losing its soul. And that is the context in which these ghost stories really took off. There was such a hunger among the public to recover Singapore's past, even if it was through ghost stories that we look backwards to ghost stories. So yes, this entire series, I do not think it would be. I do not think it would have resonated to the degree that it would have if Singapore had not been, Singaporeans and the country had not been so preoccupied with its fears of the future and development and the loss of traditional culture. As for the issue of migrants, yeah, it is interesting that the series does track current events. There are a few stories involving migrants in Singapore, not a whole lot, but they did get more common as the series progressed. And in fact, I haven't done a proper count of this, but it's quite clear to me that the Singaporean content actually decreases as the series goes on. And as the series in the later part of the series, in the last 10 years, they've stepped up the more international stories, probably because they're trying to build an international audience. It's very popular overseas, but also, not to call Singapore boring, but there are only so many hungry ghost stories one can write. But yes, there are a few stories about migrants, but interestingly, in the stories that that register most prominently to me, the migrants are not vilified. In fact, one of the stories about HDB justice involves a couple of stories actually involve migrants being wronged. The migrants were victims of crimes and their ghosts came back to aid in solving their own murders. So it is really interesting that there's almost a little bit of sympathy for migrants in some of these stories. So that's what I have.
Thank
Yeah, so
you.
I don't know how we
Tiffany.
want. Thank you. I'll
Don't worry about it. I wanted to actually highlight some of the questions that are going in the chat. I think there's a lot of remarks going around, especially around serving NS or national service and ghost stories.
Yes.
So the particular question, I think, by Manish Malwani, who says, interestingly, so many of the ghost stories in NS seem to serve a function of controlling the behavior of enlistees. Example, don't shine your torch light up at the trees, don't go into that floor of your company line. Do we see, the question is, some ghost stories as working to reinforce institutional power dynamics in this context, maybe in Singapore in general? And then just to add on so that you have them in your mind, obviously you don't have to answer all the questions. Joshua Komarov says, just a comment, there's a fascinating study of spirit possessions of foreign female domestic workers at shelters in Singapore. And then Beatrice Wong. So there's one question about the reinforcing institutional dynamics. And there's another question from Beatrice Wong who says, if the nature of Russell Lee books are collated by a group of ghostwriters, we can't exactly escape their overarching point. Perhaps they're disconnected from the original contributors' intent. So are we really examining the use of ghost stories as the vehicle for our publishers' objectives?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, great questions. First of all, about national service. I read through the entire series and there's more where this came from. And I originally had a couple of, there are enough stories about national service to write another paper, and I do plan to do that. So let me just address that. That is its own beast, okay? NS ghost stories that I would really like to get into. So first of all, yeah, NS ghost stories are 100%, well, not 100%, but they have a very, very strong cautionary element to them. And it serves a practical purpose to discipline young NS men, to teach them how to respect space, to not shine your torchlight, and just to behave cautiously, and also to look out for your friends, because that is a very important theme in national service. What else do I have to say? So what else is there to say about national service ghost stories? In terms of anxiety, so apart from the very practical level anxieties about danger and losing your friends in the forest and teamwork, many of the anxieties relate to the rural. So it is a very urban perspective, very urban types of fears on rural landscapes and how they are untamable and unknowable. And NS stories provide an interesting foil to Dr. Wei Sing Gui's question about immigrants, because conversely, NS stories set in Pulau Ubin and sometimes overseas, but mostly in Pulau Ubin, deal with nativism. Most of the ghosts you can tell that they were natives who used to stay there. I didn't even get into talking about race in this series of stories, but the places are heavily racialized. So the kampong is racialized. Many of the stories involve Malays to a degree that you don't really see in HDB stories. And one of the opening story that I started with, it is quite interesting that this is one of the occasions where they actually call out that the person is Chinese. It's because the author, the protagonist of the story is Malay. So she said, there's this old Chinese lady and she was very money-minded. So there's a little bit of a little bit of an archetype, a stereotype going on. That's fine. That's cool. And so in NS stories, many of the ghosts are Southeast Asian, or they're Pontianak. So they're either Chinese or they're Malay, disproportionate amount of that. So those are the anxieties. Okay, so I want to address Beatrice Wang's B's, my friend B's question about the provenance of the source, which I find very interesting. And B is completely right that this is an edited volume. It's not a raw, unfiltered volume of people's stories. So to what extent are we really analyzing? Can we really generalize? What can we generalize this to if this is this represents just a handful of people's opinions? Well, on the one hand, yes, you're right. It does represent it does reflect the sensibilities of a small number of people. And I will go even further to say that you can tell that these are, Anglophone, English educated, and ironically, there is a little bit of a Christian sensibility, monotheistic Christian sensibility in these books. So I would not be surprised if we found out that was what was driving it. And it's not even that subtle. There was this a little bit of a controversy, just a little splash with volume 27 with one of the features railing against wokeness, and the talking points are very, they are quite identifiably part of a particular milieu. So on the one hand, it is kind of limited, but I think as long as we are aware of this and we make allowances for this, we won't overextend the analysis too much. But another point to remember is that this series is massively popular. 1.5 million copies, generations of school children. And on the one hand, while it is difficult to tease out the cause and effect of these stories, a really, really popular cultural product like this doesn't always set trends. It does in terms of influencing and shaping the consciousness of young generations, but they also follow trends, and that is part of their appeal. So if it resonates with a broader public, even though it's admittedly children, it means that they are capturing something relevant to Singaporeans. And
I was just going to briefly interrupt and say that the chat is very lively and will be recorded for you. But it's going on about what you say about the kinds of generational changes and evolution, and also, current events that kind of bleed into, sorry for the bad pun, bleed into the stories themselves. I wanted to just highlight a couple more things. I don't think we have time to get to them, but I do want to credit the audience members for asking these questions. So there's that question about generational change. And then Waikit Aoyong says, thank you for your fascinating talk. Thinking to what extent are folkloric traditions intertwined with religious worldviews and how they're important for understanding how ghost stories should be read in a Southeast Asian context that encompasses multicultural spiritual domains, holding worlds of spirit and energies that are often unseen. And then Faith Lai writes, your talk in the group discussion has established that myth making can both be an expression of public anxieties and desires and a way to influence public consciousness. So what she asked whether you've observed if the stories and their overarching morals can be categorized into expression or influence. And are there specific archetypes that tend to show up when the story falls into these categories of expression or influence? Whose concerns get heard and who is just an agent that has to be controlled? And I'm really sorry that there is actually no more time to answer these questions, but I really want to thank the audience members. Your questions have been so thoughtful, and I'm sure I speak maybe also for, I don't want to speak for Tiffany, but Tiffany, I mean, that was just such a rich and fascinating presentation. I feel like we could go on for 3 hours and still have this amazing conversation. And thank you so much, Wei-Sin, as well. There's a lot of lively stuff going on in the chat, and that I think that will enliven more these discussions. And thank you for taking on this popular this sort of popular genre that no one has that's really been understudied, I think. So that's thanks to you. Thanks to the team as well as helped organize this. And thank you everyone for coming this Sunday morning.
Sunday, yes.
It's Saturday here in Vancouver. So and in the West Coast where Wei-Sin is. So thank you again. And everyone's looking forward to more of your work, as you can see in the chat, Tiffany.
Thank you so much, Wei-Sin, Joanne, Academia SG team, and to the audience. I'm really grateful that you spent your Sunday morning with me. Don't worry, audience. I'm gonna write about NS stories. I might even do some interviews. But thank you, everybody. Bye.